HTML specification. But this talk was about HTML5 and friends, which means that it's much more than just the HTML5 specification. One of the key things which was, which was being worked on apart from HTML5 was also CSS3. So till now, what we used to do was CSS2 or CSS1, but now you also have CSS3. One of the key differences between CSS3 and other similar standards was the fact that CSS3 is not just one document. It's a series or a number of different specifications. So it's kind of like a modular thing. And each and every different specification defines something else. But going, that I'm just going on a tangent. But let's come back to why it actually makes sense for you as a designer to learn more about CSS3. Well, in a nutshell, the reason why is because in CSS3 you can do stuff much more simply. There was using CSS2 you could do stuff, but some of those things you required Photoshop to do or some other image editor to do. With CSS3 you can do the same things using just normal code, and we'll see how, right? You can do stuff like rounded corners or using any kind of font you like. You can even animate stuff a little bit on the page. You can rotate and skew elements. You can have text shadows, drop shadows. You can make stuff opaque, translucent, transparent. And you can also code once and have it adjust for multiple devices, which is good for, mobile development or, iPad development, whatever. So let's see more about CSS3. One of the most important things to learn about CSS3 is border radius. So if you go to any web page, any really well-designed web page nowadays on the web, you'll see at least one instance of rounded corners, right? So how do you do this? How do you make rounded corners? Till CSS2, if you wanted to make rounded corners, you had to make 4 separate images, one for each corner, and then apply, one corner for each div. So you actually had one div, and then you had 3 wrapper divs, which had no other purpose other than to have just a corner or just have an image assigned to it. Now this thing, apart from making really bad semantic sense, also made sure that your code size is increased, it becomes less maintainable, as well as the fact that you're actually using images. So you can't really change it later on without actually opening up an image editor. So what you do now with CSS3 is use something called border radius. And what it does is it says that it defines the corner of a particular box and the size of it. So if you want all 4 corners to have the same kind of border radius, then you just say border radius 5px, for example. Then all 4 corners will have 5px. But you can also specify like different corners, and how much of a radius they should have. For example, in this code example over here, what I say is border radius 5px, 10px, 15px, and 20px. So over here what will happen is the top left corner will have 5px, the top right corner will have 10px, the bottom right will have 15px, and the bottom left will have 20px border radius, right? And this is how it goes. It goes clockwise, starting from the top left corner. Right? You can also specify it, in another way, like border top left radius, border top right radius, and stuff like that. And it really is very, very useful because you can now do a whole lot more. For example, we have this, and look at the code over here, and look at how it's changing as I'm changing the border radius. And yes, using border radius, you can even make, if you're clever about it, you can even make a div which is a complete circle, right? As in this example. It's very, very cool, and it's very, very nice to know and essential to know actually if you're a designer. border radius. The next thing I wanted to talk about was web fonts. Till now, if you wanted to use your own custom font inside a web page, there was absolutely no guarantee that that same font will be installed on the user's computer, which meant that you couldn't really, in any realistic way, use your own font inside a web page. There were only about 6 fonts that you could use reliably across browsers and across operating systems. Stuff like Times New Roman or Verdana or Georgia, or even actually Comic Sans. So now in CSS3 we wanted to make sure that this this hindrance is not there. So now what you do is make use of web fonts, and it's very, very easy to do. All you say is all you do is first define the font using the font face property, the add font face property. So the add font face property is very, very easy to learn. It just says add font face src URL is equal to whatever the URL of the TTF font is or the OTF font is, and font family, what you're going to call it, right? So add font face is nothing but saying that, okay, this is the URL and this is what I'm calling the font. And whenever you want to use it inside a web page, just say, font, 2.5 EM or whatever, that font, right? The name you've given. That's it. You can use any TTF font or any OTF font, or something which is even better is called WOF that we'll take a look later on. But before I mention that, one thing I also wanted to say was the fact that web fonts are not just for English fonts. You can use it on pretty much any kind of font, whether it's Hindi, whether it's Malayalam, whether it's Russian, whatever. As long as the font supports that language, you can use it, right? So this is just an example of what I made, just a small page that I made, which is using different fonts. The lowest one is the system default font, and the various fonts above that are custom fonts that I've used, right? And you can see the difference in the way it's being served. So one more advantage of using web fonts is the fact that not only does it look sometimes better, but also the fact that sometimes it actually makes sure that the things are much more readable. What I've noticed, especially when it comes to regional fonts and Indian regional fonts, is the fact that if you just have the native system default font, sometimes what happens is it's not really clearly legible. But if you use a nice web font, then sometimes it becomes a little bit more legible, right? So it's not just for style, sometimes it's for a very practical purpose. Sometimes you can use it just for increasing the legibility of fonts. So let's come back to the new format that we're going to talk about. So of course you can use any OTF font or any TTF font. But apart from that, there's a new font format called WOF, which is much better. The reason is because it's actually optimized for the web. A WOF file is basically just a zip file or a compressed file, which includes the actual TTF or OTF font, but also certain licensing information, and it also has better cross-browser support than TTF or OTF. So the reason why is because even IE will support WOF. There's a very, very good site for free fonts in TTF, OTF, or WOF font format. It's called Font Squirrel. So if you just go to Font Squirrel, right, this is the site fontsquirrel.com, and over here you'll find plenty of very, very nice fonts in TTF, OTF, or even WOF format, right? And it's very, very nice. So if you choose WOF over here, TTF, there are various file formats you can see. So you can go to add font face kits, and over there are various kits that you can use. And you can just download the zip file, which will have the licensing info. It will have the TTF or OTF or even WOF file. And it's a very, very nice place to visit and download fonts. So coming back to our presentation. So this was about web fonts and how you can use custom fonts, and we've seen the code as well. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was text shadows. So till now, if you wanted to do drop shadows on text or on boxes, you once again had to open an image editor. You had to open something like Photoshop or GIMP. But now you can do it natively inside the browser without using anything else. This is sample code of how you can do it. So on text, what you do is something called text shadow. This is the code for it. You just say text shadow, 0px, 0px, or whatever. So basically, it's the horizontal offset, the vertical offset, the blur radius, and the color, right? So over here, if it's the horizontal offset, if it's a positive value, then it goes to the right. Otherwise, it goes to the left. The next is the vertical offset. If it's a positive value, it goes towards the bottom. Otherwise, it goes towards the top. Then it's the blur radius. How much of a blur do you want on the shadow? And then you have a color for it. So let's see a small example of what I'm actually talking about when it comes to text shadow. Let's go to my site, text shadows. So as you can see over here, there are various text shadows applied in various ways. Over here, there's a different kind of text shadow. It's towards the upper right-hand side. This is a different kind of text shadow. It's much more sharp, right? It's because the blur radius is 0, and I've had it over the bottom left side of the text. And over here, there's a different text shadow over here, towards the top. So it's very, very simple and easy to do. And just like you have text shadow, similarly, if you want to do a drop shadow on a div, for example, you can use something called box shadow, which works exactly the same way. There's literally no difference in the way it's used between that item. The only difference with box shadow is it'll apply to a box, so it'll apply to a div, for example. Right? An example of this would be one of our developers who made something like this. Notice the boxes and notice the shadows over here, right? And the blur of the shadows as well. So this is something one of our developers made just as a hobby, and you'll see box shadows applied over here very, very easily. So let's go back. One more thing which was missing when it came to CSS3 was support for multiple columns. So if you ever gone and seen a typical newspaper, you'll find that they are in different columns, or even a scientific research paper, they're in different columns. Till now, if you wanted to do that using CSS2 or 1, there were ways to do it, but there were very, very hacky ways to do it. There wasn't a proper standard way to do it. Now you have something called multi-column support in CSS3. So all you need to do is just enter your text inside a div, right? And implement these particular things. So if you wanted to have like 3 columns, just say column count 3. Then you specify the width of each column. So you say column width 100 px, for example. And if you wanted to have like a rule between them, then just say column rule 1 px solid black, right? So multiple columns is also something which is quite useful sometimes, especially if you want to do some kind of newspaper layout, or some kind of if you want to compress text inside a very constrained area, you can use multiple columns to do that, and it's very easy to do. So let's move on. Now comes one of my favorite parts of the presentation, which is CSS transforms and transitions. So if you look at the code over here, don't be overwhelmed. Just look at this part. O transition property background color, O transition duration 4 seconds, right? So transitions are basically just transitioning the state of a div or something else from one state to the other, from one property to the other. So in this case, what I'm saying is transition the background color and take 4 seconds to do it. And whenever someone hovers over this, whenever someone hovers over the div, the background color will be changed to blue. First it's red, now it's blue, right? That's it. Let's see some examples just to make sure that we get what we're trying to do. So this is a very simple example. If I hover over this, you see it changes. Something like this previously required Flash to do, but now you can do it very, very easily using just CSS transitions. All I say is, just transition the letter spacing and the opacity when I hover over this div, and take, a specified amount of seconds to do it. And you can do much more than that. You can do something like this. You can create something like a lost effect using just CSS3, transitions and transforms. One more thing that I wanted to show you was this navigation bar. So if you look at the top, it says navigation, and if I hover over this, it increases in size and pops up this navigation menu. None of this actually requires JS. I'm doing this using just CSS3. And notice also that the background color changes from white to yellow. And if I remove this, then it goes away and turns back to white. So yeah, this is also done using just straight up CSS3, no JavaScript once again. And you'll also notice this thing. You also notice the did you know section, which is kind of skewed, and it also uses box shadow once again. This is also done using something called transforms. So there's a very, very nice article on this. Just search for DevOpera CSS transitions and transforms, and you'll see, you'll get a very, very nice article on how to do these things. Let's go back. Don't have much time, so I'll just rush through. One important thing was also media queries. And there's a very, very nice article on a list apart. So there's a very nice article on a list apart called Responsive Web Design by Ethan Marcotte, and it actually is a very nice introduction to media queries. Now, what are media queries? Why are they important? The reason why they're important is because when it comes to various devices, the web is not just about desktop anymore. No, it's about various devices. And all these various devices nowadays have various resolutions, various screen sizes. And how do you make sure that you write one interface using one set of CSS and it adjusts itself, according to the different widths and heights? This is done using media queries. So what you do is you say, at media all, min width 480px, max width 800px, for example. Then this particular CSS will be applied, right? And if it's less than 480px, you just say at media all, max width 480px, then this particular set of CSS will be applied, right? So using min width, max width, you can actually make sure that you make sure that various ranges of widths and heights are supported by your CSS. So you can say if the width is between this and this, then have this kind of CSS applied. If the width is between that and that, then have that kind of CSS applied, right? And you can combine it into one main CSS file and be done with it. right? So you can make sure that various screen sizes and resolutions are supported by writing CSS just once. Of course, you have to test it, and there are various emulators that you can use to test. One place for design inspiration would be media queries, media query.es, which is a showcase of sites which actually use media queries right now that you can see. And it's a very nice site to just go ahead and look for inspiration and just see how they have implemented media queries right now. Media queries are supported on Opera, Opera Mobile, and also on the iPhone. So they're already supported, by major mobile browsers, and you can use them, today itself. You don't have to wait. Let's move on. We'll skip SVG because everyone knows what SVG is by now. We'll come back. We'll come to the concept of offline web applications that we were talking about recently. We talked about how to store the actual files, but what about the data? We can store the actual files needed to needed for the application to run offline using application cache. But what about the data? If you're making an email application, for example, you need the actual emails to load, right? So what do you do with those things? How do you store data? Till now, if you wanted to store pretty much any kind of data, you had to use cookies. But the problem with cookies is they're unreliable. There's no programmatic APIs to manipulate cookies really. It's kind of like a hackish way to do it. And they're not really structured in any way. And the most important part is the fact that cookies are very small in size. The maximum amount that you can store in a cookie is usually 2 KB, but sometimes it's 4 KB in certain browsers. That's it. And 4 KB isn't really enough for nowadays, web applications to do stuff. So we needed a solution which was better than just cookies. And that's why we have something called web storage. In particular, there's a thing called local storage, which is a little bit more persistent. So if you store something using local storage, then even if you close the browser and then open it up once again, it will still be there. It's persistent. The other part of web storage is session storage. So if you close the browser and open it once again, the page, the information will be gone. So depending on the use case, use either way. Local storage is a way to store data in a much more structured format. So what you do is you store it as a key value pair. The storage you just say in your JavaScript, local storage.set item, your key, your value. So it will store that value. And if you want to retrieve that once again in the JavaScript, you just say, a var something is equal to local storage.get item, and then put in the key. So it'll, in the item you'll get the value for that particular key, right? So using web storage or local storage, now you have a proper programmatic API. One more thing is the browsers which do support web storage, the default, by default, it's 5 MB per origin. So you can store much more than just 2 KB or 4 KB. You can store up to 5 MB. And even if you store more than 5 MB, if the user allows it, then you can actually store it. So let's move on to our last topic.